Kyla Trenwick appeared to be just another quiet mother in a nondescript apartment. But behind her locked door, 2-year-old Nova Trenwick was living a nightmare so disturbing, even seasoned detectives were shaken when they uncovered the truth. The quiet suburb of Marlow Ridge, the days moved slowly and the nights were even slower. Neighbors kept mostly to themselves, nodding politely at one another in passing, but rarely forming more than surface-level connections. It was the kind of place where secrets could hide in plain sight, shielded by white picket fences and the illusion of normalcy. Apartment 3B, on the second floor of the Birchwood complex, didn't stand out from the others. Its windows were always shut, curtains always drawn, and a small potted plant sat wilting on the sill. No one really knew who lived there, only that a woman had moved in around 2 years ago with a baby and never seemed to speak to anyone. Seth Quorn, who lived directly next door in 3A, was one of the few people who occasionally noticed something wasn't quite right. A freelance graphic designer who worked odd hours, Seth was used to quiet during the day and the occasional noise from neighboring units. But over the past few months, a disturbing pattern had emerged. Nearly every night, around 11, he began hearing faint crying, small, stifled sobs that didn't sound like typical toddler fussing. It was a broken kind of weeping, as though whoever was crying had long since given up expecting comfort. The crying would go on for minutes, sometimes an hour, then abruptly stop. At first, Seth assumed the child was simply hard to soothe, but it happened too frequently, and the cries were too desperate. There was something unnatural about it. Still, like many others, Seth hesitated. Calling the authorities felt extreme, especially when he had no proof that anything was truly wrong. He didn't want to accuse a neighbor of something so serious, based only on sounds through a wall. He told himself maybe the mother was struggling, maybe she needed help, but not necessarily doing harm. That rationalization kept him silent for a while, until the night the crying turned into thuds. It was just past midnight when Seth was jolted awake by a sharp bang against the shared wall, followed by a muffled shriek. The sound was short, but unmistakably alarming. Then silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the kind that left the air heavy and the mind racing. Seth lay frozen for several minutes, trying to convince himself he'd misheard. But the longer the silence stretched, the more his chest tightened. Eventually, he picked up his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. He explained what he'd been hearing for weeks, emphasizing that something felt off. The dispatcher assured him someone would be sent to check things out. Within 20 minutes, a squad car pulled into the lot. Officer Juno Red knocked on the door of apartment 3B. When it opened, Seth watched from his peephole, heart pounding. The Kyla woman who answered was thin, pale, and wore an expression that was neither warm nor defensive, just eerily neutral. Her hair was stringy and damp, as if she'd just stepped out of a shower. Officer Red asked a few questions, peering into the apartment from the doorway. Kyla Trenwick, the name she gave, responded calmly, said her daughter was sleeping and had been fussy due to teething. She offered no invitation to enter. Officer Red, having no legal grounds to force her way in without evidence of imminent danger, had little choice but to note the complaint and file a report. Seth felt a pang of guilt. He had hoped something would come of the visit, some immediate rescue or at least confirmation that his suspicions were wrong. Instead, the door closed, the officer left, and the night resumed its oppressive quiet. But the incident was now on record. What neither Seth nor Officer Red knew was that behind the locked door of the back room, a 2-year-old girl sat alone in darkness, too weak to cry any longer. The thud had been her small body hitting the wall. And though she couldn't speak, her silence spoke volumes. Something was deeply, horrifyingly wrong in apartment 3B, and it wouldn't stay hidden for much longer. Detective Elric Dane had seen a lot in his 15 years on the force. Cases that disturbed him, confused him, even broke him a little. But Something about the initial report from Officer Juno Red bothered him more than most. The officer's notes were brief, but the tone hinted at something she couldn't quite put into words. A child possibly in distress, a mother with a blank stare, a neighbor worried enough to call. It wasn't enough to demand immediate action, but it was enough for Dane to keep the file on his desk rather than passing it into the system's long list of non-urgent concerns. He started with a simple background check on the mother, Kyla Trenwick. What came back was unexpected. There were no major red flags, no criminal record, no previous child welfare reports. But there was something even more concerning. A lack of anything at all. No employment records, no tax filings, no schooling past the age of 16, no hospital records, no previous addresses prior to 2 years ago. She had legally existed, but only barely. The trail went cold almost immediately before she moved into Birchwood Apartments. It was like she had appeared from nowhere. Curious, Dane dug deeper. He contacted the local health department, looking for any medical records. For the child, Nova Trenwick, there were none. No birth certificate filed locally, no visits to pediatricians, no vaccination history, no records of daycare enrollment. The child, like her mother, was invisible in official systems. That was not only strange, it was alarming. This stage, the police still had no proof of a crime, so Detective Dane decided to loop in Child Protective Services to request a wellness check. He handed the case to Mara Velen, a seasoned social worker who had handled difficult situations before. She agreed to visit the home under the pretext of a routine family assistance outreach. When Mara arrived at apartment 3B, she was struck by how still the place felt. Kyla opened the door slowly, and for a moment just stared at Mara without speaking. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, she offered a hesitant nod and allowed her inside. The apartment was small and dimly lit, with all the blinds drawn and a faint smell of bleach hanging in the air. Toys were noticeably absent, though Mara did see an overturned sippy cup in the kitchen sink. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse. Mara asked to see Nova. Kyla responded vaguely, saying the child was asleep in the back room. When Mara gently requested to take a quick look to ensure she was okay, Kyla grew tense. She claimed the room was locked because it contained cleaning supplies and that Nova had fallen asleep in the front bedroom instead. Mara glanced at the door Kyla had pointed to. It was shut tightly, with a simple latch on the outside. But she didn't push. Social workers were trained to observe and report, not confront or accuse without reason. She took mental notes. The locked door, the smell, the lack of toys, the strangely silent apartment. When Mara left, she sat in her car for several minutes reviewing her notes. Something wasn't adding up. A mother who appeared emotionally detached, a child who seemed to exist off the grid, a back room that Kyla wouldn't allow her to enter. She filed her report that night, marking it as concerning with potential for escalation. That one word, potential, was enough to trigger the next step in the process, an emergency review for a court-ordered welfare inspection. Meanwhile, Detective Dane continued tracing Kyla's digital footprint, or what little there was of it. He began searching national databases for anyone who might match her basic description, but had used a different name. The absence of a paper trail was starting to feel intentional. People didn't just erase their past without reason. With the emergency order underway and suspicions mounting, the pressure began to build. What was behind the locked door? Who was Kyla Trenwick really? And most importantly, was Nova still safe? The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it wasn't clear yet. All that was certain was this. Something was very wrong inside apartment 3B, and they were running out of time to uncover the truth. The court order arrived just after noon on a Thursday. Detective Elric Dane didn't waste a second. He gathered a small team, 2 uniformed officers, a representative from Child Protective Services, and a forensic specialist, and drove straight to Birchwood Apartments. This time, they weren't knocking politely. This time, they had the legal authority to go inside, with or without consent. They reached apartment 3B by 12:45 p.m. Kyla Trenwick opened the door, her expression blank and unbothered. She didn't argue when shown the court order. She simply stepped aside and watched as the group entered her home. The same smell Mara Vellin had described, chemical and sharp, hit them immediately. The curtains were still drawn, casting the apartment in a dim gray light. The silence was deafening. Officer Juno Red moved quickly toward the back of the apartment. The locked door Mara had mentioned still had a latch on the outside, secured with a padlock. That, in itself, raised alarms. No child's room should be locked from the outside. The padlock was cut and the door creaked open. Inside, they found a tiny, windowless closet. The air was thick with the smell of mold, urine, and bleach. There was no bed, just a pile of damp, soiled blankets on the floor. In the middle of it all sat a small girl, curled up with her arms around her knees. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. Her hair was tangled and greasy, her skin pale and bruised. She wasn't crying. She wasn't making a sound. Her expression was hollow, like she had already given up on being heard. Nova Trenwick was just 2 years old, but in that moment she looked older, tired in a way no child should ever be. Her wrists had faint red marks, and a roll of duct tape was discovered in the room nearby. Her diaper was full and had clearly not been changed in many hours. There were half-eaten, moldy crackers in a corner and a sippy cup with sour milk inside. The closet had no ventilation, no light, and no toys. It was not a room, it was a cell. Detective Dane signaled to the paramedics waiting outside. Nova was carried out gently, barely reacting to the sudden movement. Her small body didn't resist. She didn't cling. She didn't ask for her mother. It was as though she had already learned not to expect comfort from anyone. Kyla, meanwhile, stood in the center of the living room, unmoving. When asked why her daughter was locked inside a closet, she answered in a flat tone that Nova was difficult to manage, and that timeouts were sometimes necessary. She spoke without emotion, without guilt. She explained the bruises as accidental. She denied using restraints, despite the obvious evidence. As officers placed her in handcuffs, Kyla didn't protest. She didn't cry. She didn't ask about her daughter. She stared blankly at the floor as if none of it concerned her. Her demeanor wasn't just strange, it was unnerving. Nova was taken to the hospital immediately. Doctors confirmed signs of long-term neglect and physical abuse, malnourishment, dehydration, bruising in various stages of healing. The medical team said it was a miracle the child was still alive. One nurse, hardened by years of experience, had to step out of the room to cry. Child Protective Services placed Nova under emergency protective custody. Meanwhile, detectives began processing the apartment as a crime scene. They found journals, with erratic writing, pages ripped out, and strange entries about cleansing and purity. A few crude drawings of a stick figure child locked behind bars sent chills down every spine in the room. Detective Dane had no doubt now. This wasn't just a case of a struggling mother. This was abuse, deliberate, repeated, hidden in plain sight behind the walls of a quiet suburban apartment. And if Kyla had gone to such lengths to isolate her daughter, then it was possible, perhaps even likely, that she was hiding more than just a broken child. The investigation was no longer just about what happened to Nova. It had become a hunt for the truth about who Kyla Trenwick really was, and whether there were more victims in her past. At the Marlow Ridge Medical Center, Nova Trenwick remained under close observation. Pediatric specialists worked around the clock to stabilize her fragile condition. She had not spoken a word since her rescue, not even a whimper. Doctors determined she was suffering from severe developmental delays, likely due to isolation and trauma. Her motor skills were weak, and she recoiled from touch. The toll of 2 years in darkness, abuse, and neglect had altered her very way of interacting with the world. Child psychologist Dr. Lyra Naves was brought in to assess the child. Her findings were heartbreaking. Nova had no concept of human connection, no trust, no understanding of safety. She did not cry for her mother. She did not cry at all. Instead, she sat quietly, staring at corners of the room, flinching only at loud noises or sudden movements. Dr. Naves noted signs of what she called silent survival, a term used for children so traumatized that even fear became internalized. Nova had been taught, unintentionally and cruelly, that her survival depended on being invisible. While medical staff focused on healing Nova's body and mind, Detective Elric Dane continued to dig into Kyla Trenwick's background. And with each search, a darker shadow began to emerge. Using national fingerprint databases, forensic teams discovered that Kyla's prints matched those of a woman reported missing over 4 years ago under a different name, Soraya Elwin. At the time of her disappearance, Soraya had been a 20-year-old college dropout from Nebraska. She had vanished after filing a police report against a man she claimed had been stalking her. No follow-up was ever conducted, and she was eventually declared voluntarily missing. Further investigation unearthed a disturbing detail. Soraya had once been hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation following a mental breakdown. She had been diagnosed with a rare personality disorder involving paranoid delusions and emotional detachment. Her records showed multiple instances of erratic behavior, including attempts to isolate herself and expressing a desire to start over somewhere no one could reach her. It appeared that she had done just that, disappeared, changed her identity to Kyla Trenwick, and built a hidden life far from anyone who had known her before. But what stunned the team most was what they found next. Hospital records from a rural clinic in Oklahoma, dated 3 years ago, listed Soraya Elwin, under her original name, as being treated for pregnancy-related complications. At the time, she had refused prenatal counseling, provided false contact information, and left the clinic before delivery. There was no record of a live birth being filed. The hospital staff noted that she had appeared disoriented and extremely guarded. After that visit, she vanished from the system once again, until reappearing as Kyla Trenwick in Marlow Ridge. There was now strong evidence that Kyla had given birth to Nova in secret, outside any proper medical setting, and raised her in complete isolation. This explained the lack of official documents, no birth certificate, no immunizations. Nova had been born off the grid, hidden from society from day one. Detective Dane shared the new information with CPS and the prosecutor's office. A full psychological evaluation of Kyla was ordered. In custody, she had remained cold and silent, only speaking in vague, abstract phrases about purity and the silence of innocence. A court-appointed psychiatrist confirmed that Kyla was mentally unstable but also fully aware of her actions. She had created a world of control, where Nova existed not as a daughter, but as a possession, a being she could shape, punish, and confine. The case became national news within days. Public outrage swelled as details of Nova's treatment emerged. Media dubbed her the girl in the closet. But for Detective Dane, the headlines didn't matter. His focus remained on ensuring Nova would never return to that nightmare, and that Kyla would never harm another soul. As the trial date approached, preparations were made to transfer Nova to a long-term care facility where specialists could slowly rebuild her shattered sense of safety. But even as the system moved forward, a question lingered in everyone's mind. Had Kyla done this before? And if so, where were the others? The courtroom was packed on the morning of Kyla Trenwick's trial. News crews lined the courthouse steps, whispering into microphones about the girl in the closet. Inside, silence filled the air as the judge entered and the proceedings began. Kyla sat motionless at the defense table, her expression unreadable, dressed in a plain gray prison uniform. She neither acknowledged the judge nor her own attorney. Her face showed no remorse, no sorrow, only an unsettling stillness that made even the most experienced officials uneasy. The prosecution laid out a detailed and harrowing case. They presented photographic evidence of the closet where Nova had been confined. No windows, no lights, walls smeared with mildew and rot. Medical experts testified about the extent of the child's malnutrition, the signs of repeated physical abuse, and the emotional trauma so severe it had left Nova speechless. Witnesses from Child Protective Services, including Mara Vellin, described their encounters with Kyla and the disturbing conditions of the apartment. Their words painted a vivid picture of a child hidden, harmed, and forgotten. But the trial revealed even more than what had initially been suspected. Forensic investigators who combed through Kyla's journals and electronic devices uncovered encrypted files and handwritten entries suggesting the existence of another child. One entry in particular chilled everyone in the courtroom. It read, "First was too loud. Second will be quiet. Second will be perfect." A DNA test, conducted on biological material found in the apartment, confirmed the existence of another infant, one whose body was never found. Investigators discovered remnants of baby clothes, an old crib stored in a padlocked basement storage unit, and a stained blanket buried beneath cleaning supplies. While no official records existed for this first child, digital forensics linked Kyla's past hospital visit in Oklahoma to a probable stillbirth or unexplained infant disappearance. The case was reopened, but without a body, prosecutors could not file charges related to the second child. Still, the implications were enough to shake the jury. Kyla's defense attorney attempted an insanity plea, arguing that her long-standing psychiatric disorder had rendered her incapable of understanding right from wrong. Court-appointed psychiatrists, however, testified otherwise. Though mentally ill, Kyla had acted with deliberate and methodical intent. She had concealed her identity, evaded institutions, and systematically removed all traces of Nova's existence from public record. Her decisions were not the result of psychosis, but of control, absolute and chilling. In the end, the jury took only 4 hours to reach a verdict. Kyla Trenwick was found guilty of multiple counts: felony child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, endangerment of a minor, and aggravated neglect. The judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. There was no reaction from Kyla. She stared ahead as if none of it mattered, her expression unchanged, as though the courtroom were merely another room in her carefully constructed cage. Back at the medical center, Nova's progress was slow but steady. Under the careful supervision of therapists, she began to show small signs of healing. She made eye contact with her caretakers, responded to her name, and accepted gentle touch. One day, after months of silence, she pointed to a stuffed animal and made a soft sound, her first attempt at communication. It was barely audible, but for the staff, it was a breakthrough. Child Protective Services worked tirelessly to find her a long-term foster family trained to care for trauma survivors. After extensive evaluation, a couple with backgrounds in child psychology and rehabilitation was selected. Nova was introduced to her new environment gradually. Her new room was filled with warm light, toys, and gentle music. The door remained open at all times. As she adjusted to her new life, Nova began to experience things she never knew existed: bedtime stories, soft blankets, and meals that came without fear. Her future was still uncertain, and the scars of her early years would never fully vanish. But she was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. She was safe. The story of Nova Trenwick became a symbol, not just of horror, but of resilience. A reminder that even in the darkest places, light can break through. And for those sworn to protect the most vulnerable, it was a case they would never forget.